The sun shone brightly over the city of Chicago that Saturday afternoon. It was a perfect day for a wedding. The air smelled of fresh roses and vanilla cake, and soft music played from the large speakers set up in the elegant backyard of a suburban mansion. Laughter and joy filled the air as guests raised their glasses to celebrate the union of Daniel Carter and his new bride, Jessica. Daniel was a respected businessman in the city, known for his charm and success. Jessica, a kind-hearted school teacher, had captured his heart after his bitter divorce from his first wife, Evelyn. Their love story had been like a fairy tale, or so it seemed. As the wedding reception went on, waiters moved through the crowd, serving champagne and hors d'oeuvres. The highlight of the evening was the dessert, a special ice cream treat, Jessica's favorite. It was a surprise planned by Daniel, a sweet touch to make the day even more memorable. The children at the wedding, including Daniel's three kids from his previous marriage, Lily, 12, Jake, 9, and little Emma, 6, were especially excited. They rushed to the dessert table, eager to taste the creamy delight. Evelyn stood at the edge of the party, watching everything unfold with a fake smile. Dressed in a modest navy blue dress, she had been invited only for the sake of their children. No one could see the storm of emotions raging inside her. She had spent 10 years with Daniel, only for him to leave her and marry Jessica just a year later. Evelyn had been humiliated, discarded like an old newspaper. She had loved him once, but now all she felt was resentment, and today she had decided to make them pay. She had spent weeks planning this moment. It had to be perfect. A tasteless, odorless poison carefully mixed into a single serving of ice cream, the one meant for Jessica. The poison would take effect within minutes, shutting down her organs one by one. By the time anyone realized what had happened, it would be too late. Jessica would be gone. Evelyn watched as the waiter carried the special cup of ice cream toward the bride. Her heart pounded in her chest. This was it. But just as the dessert was placed in front of Jessica, a soft giggle filled the air. "Daddy, can we have some?" Little Emma's voice rang out as she and her siblings rushed to the table. Before Daniel or Jessica could respond, the three children grabbed the cup of ice cream and began passing it among themselves, laughing and taking large spoonfuls. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. "No," she whispered, frozen in horror. But it was too late. Within minutes, the joy of the wedding turned into chaos. Lily clutched her stomach, her face contorted in pain. Jake fell to the ground, convulsing violently. Emma gasped for air, her small hands clawing at her throat. Guests screamed. Daniel and Jessica rushed to the children, panic-stricken. Someone called 911. Evelyn felt her knees buckle. This was not supposed to happen. Not to them. Not her babies. The sirens wailed in the distance as ambulances arrived. Paramedics rushed in, trying to save the children. The guests looked on in shock, unable to process what was happening. As Evelyn stood there trembling, she realized the nightmare had just begun. The emergency room of St. Mary's Hospital was a scene of chaos. Doctors and nurses rushed back and forth, working desperately to save the three children. Daniel and Jessica stood outside the intensive care unit, their hands tightly clasped together, their faces pale with fear. Lily had slipped into a coma. Jake's body was still convulsing from the toxins attacking his nervous system. Little Emma, barely breathing, was on life support. A detective arrived at the hospital, his sharp eyes scanning the distressed faces around him. Detective Mark Reynolds was a seasoned investigator with over 20 years in homicide and poisoning cases. He had seen his fair share of tragedies, but something about this case felt personal. A wedding, children poisoned, and the possibility of a deliberate attack. This wasn't just food contamination. Someone had done this on purpose. Mark approached Daniel and Jessica. "Mr. Carter, Mrs. Carter, I'm Detective Reynolds. I need to ask you a few questions." Daniel barely nodded, his voice hoarse. "My kids, are they going to make it?" "We're doing everything we can," said one of the doctors, stepping out for a moment. "We've identified a toxic substance in their system. It's not a natural foodborne illness. This was deliberate poisoning." Jessica gasped, and Daniel clenched his fists. Who would do this? Mark already had his suspicions. He had investigated enough cases to know that crimes like this often involve someone close to the victims. Someone who had a motive. He turned toward the guest list, scanning for names. One stood out immediately: the ex-wife, the mother of the victims. Mark wasted no time. He walked toward the waiting room where several guests were still gathered, whispering among themselves. And there she was, Evelyn, sitting alone in the corner, her hands shaking as she held on to her purse. Mark had interviewed enough criminals to recognize the look of guilt. He sat down beside her, his tone calm but firm. "Evelyn, I need to talk to you." She looked up, startled. "About what?" "You were at the wedding, correct?" She nodded, swallowing hard. "Of course. My kids were there." Mark tilted his head. "Did you eat anything from the dessert table?" Evelyn hesitated. "No, I—" She stopped herself, realizing she had answered too quickly. Mark studied her reaction. "Evelyn, do you have any idea how the ice cream might have been poisoned?" Her face turned pale. "Poisoned? I don't know anything about that." But Mark saw through the lie. He leaned in, lowering his voice. "Evelyn, if there's something you need to tell me, now is the time. 3 children are fighting for their lives. If you know anything, you need to speak up." Evelyn's hands gripped the fabric of her dress tightly. Her mind raced. She hadn't planned for this. She had wanted to hurt Jessica, not her own children. But if she admitted anything now, she would lose everything. Tears welled in her eyes as she whispered, "I would never hurt my kids." Mark studied her for a long moment. "I hope that's true," he said, standing up. "Because if I find out you're lying, I promise you, I will find the truth." As he walked away, Evelyn wiped her face and took a deep breath. She had made a terrible mistake, and now there was no turning back. Detective Mark Reynolds sat at his desk in the Chicago Police Department, reviewing the case files. The toxicology report had just come in, and it confirmed what he already suspected. The children had been poisoned with aconitine, a rare and highly toxic substance derived from the monkshood plant. It was not something someone could accidentally consume. It had to be deliberately administered. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temple. This wasn't just a crime of opportunity, it was premeditated. Mark picked up his phone and dialed the hospital. "Dr. Hayes, any updates on the Carter children?" The doctor sighed. "Lily is still in a coma. Jake's seizures have stopped, but he's unresponsive. Emma's condition is critical. Any chance of survival? There's a small chance if they respond to treatment, but this poison works fast. We're doing our best." Mark thanked him and hung up, his jaw tightening. He didn't have time to waste. Mark headed back to the Carter mansion, where the wedding had taken place. Officers were already there, questioning the catering staff. The event had been recorded by professional videographers, and Mark wasted no time requesting the footage. As he sat in the living room, he played the video from the moment the desserts were brought out. The camera panned across the reception, capturing the joyful guests as they enjoyed their meals. Then at the 56-minute mark, something caught his eye. A woman in a navy blue dress stood near the dessert table. Her back was turned to the camera, but Mark recognized her: Evelyn Carter. She appeared to be reaching into her purse. A few seconds later, she moved toward the trays of ice cream. Then, just as quickly as she had approached, she stepped back, blending into the crowd. Mark rewound and played it again. This time, he slowed it down. He couldn't see exactly what she had done, but her behavior was suspicious. It was enough to make him dig deeper. He called one of his officers. "Check the catering staff's statements. I want to know if anyone saw Evelyn near the desserts." Mark returned to the hospital where Daniel Carter sat beside his children's hospital beds. His face was hollow, his eyes red from exhaustion. Jessica stood beside him, clutching his hand. Mark approached carefully. "Mr. Carter, I need to ask you a difficult question." Daniel straightened. "Anything, Detective." "Do you believe Evelyn could have done this?" Daniel hesitated. "She's their mother. No matter how bitter the divorce was, she'd never—" His voice broke. "She'd never hurt them." Jessica, however, wasn't as convinced. "Detective," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "Evelyn hated me. She blamed me for everything. She said I stole her family, her life. I don't know what she's capable of anymore." Mark nodded, then turned to Daniel. "Has Evelyn ever used or mentioned poisons before?" Daniel frowned. "No, but—" "Wait." His eyes widened. "Years ago, she had this obsession with herbal medicine. She had, Books on plants, including poisonous ones. She used to say that nature had a way of balancing things out. Mark's instincts sharpened. Do you know if she still has those books? Daniel nodded slowly. She might. She kept all her old stuff at her house. That was enough for Mark. As he left the hospital, he knew where he was going next. Evelyn Carter's home. And if his gut was right, he was about to find the proof he needed. Detective Mark Reynolds pulled up outside Evelyn Carter's modest suburban home. The small two-story house looked peaceful in the afternoon sun, with neatly trimmed hedges and a children's bicycle lying on the front lawn. But Mark knew that inside, secrets were waiting to be uncovered. Two uniformed officers stood by, waiting for his orders. A search warrant had already been secured based on Evelyn's suspicious behavior in the wedding footage. With a nod, Mark stepped onto the porch and knocked. Moments later, Evelyn opened the door, her face pale. She looked like she hadn't slept. "Detective?" she said, her voice tight. "What do you want?" Mark held up the warrant. "We need to search your house." Evelyn's hands trembled slightly as she stepped aside. "Go ahead," she murmured. Mark and his team moved quickly. The living room was tidy, with framed pictures of Evelyn and the kids on the walls. It was hard to believe the woman who lived here could be responsible for such a crime, but Mark had learned long ago. Guilt hides in plain sight. They started in the kitchen, searching through cabinets and drawers for anything unusual. Then in the pantry, Mark found something that made his stomach turn. A small glass jar labeled monk's hood root. He carefully picked it up, inspecting the dried, crumbled plant inside. Aconitine, the same poison that had nearly killed the Carter children. Mark exhaled slowly. He wasn't done yet. Next, the officers moved to Evelyn's study. The room was cluttered with bookshelves filled with old medical and herbalism texts. Mark's eyes scanned the titles until he found one that stood out. Deadly Plants and Their Uses. He pulled it out and flipped through the pages. Several sections were highlighted, including one about aconitine. Notes were scribbled in the margins. Then he found it. A torn page, folded and tucked inside the book. Carefully, Mark unfolded it and read the handwritten words. A small dose, just enough to cause discomfort. Too much, and it could be lethal. Tasteless. Odorless. Works within minutes. Mark's grip tightened on the paper. This wasn't just research. This was a plan. Just then, one of the officers called out from the bathroom. "Detective, you need to see this." Mark followed him and stopped cold when he saw what was sitting in the trash can. A disposable latex glove, stained with something white. It didn't take a forensic expert to guess what it was. Ice cream. Evelyn sat stiffly on the couch as Mark placed the evidence bag on the table. "Do you want to explain this?" he asked, his voice even. Her eyes darted to the jar of monk's hood, then to the book. Then she did something Mark didn't expect. She laughed. A bitter, hollow laugh. "You think this is proof," she said. "I study plants. That book, it's research. That root, it's for pain relief." Mark leaned forward. "Then why was it in your wedding bag?" Evelyn's smile vanished. Mark pressed on. "Why were you seen near the dessert table, Evelyn? Why did you have a torn page detailing how to administer poison?" Her hands curled into fists. "Because she deserved it," she hissed. "Jessica stole my life. She took my husband, my family. And you expect me to just smile and accept it? So you poisoned her," Mark said, his voice hard. Evelyn's lip trembled. "It wasn't supposed to be my kids," she whispered. I made a mistake." Mark's jaw tightened. "That mistake put 3 innocent children in the hospital. Your own children." Tears filled Evelyn's eyes. "I just wanted her to suffer like I did," she choked out. Mark stood, signaling the officers. "Evelyn Carter, you're under arrest for attempted murder." As the handcuffs clicked around her wrists, Evelyn let out a sob. The weight of her actions had finally crashed down on her. But for Mark, the case wasn't over yet. He had to make sure those kids survived. Because justice wasn't just about finding the truth. It was about making sure the innocent lived to tell it. Evelyn Carter sat in the cold interrogation room of the Chicago Police Department, her hands cuffed to the metal table. The fluorescent light buzzed softly above her, casting shadows on her tear-streaked face. Her once proud posture had collapsed into exhaustion. Detective Mark Reynolds entered, carrying a file in one hand and a cup of water in the other. He placed the cup in front of her and took a seat across the table. "Drink," he said. Evelyn hesitated but took a small sip. Her fingers trembled around the paper cup. Mark studied her for a moment before flipping open the file. "You know why you're here?" She nodded but said nothing. Mark leaned forward. "Evelyn, I need you to walk me through everything. The truth. If there's even a chance of helping your children, you owe it to them." At the mention of her kids, Evelyn let out a shaky breath. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "It wasn't supposed to be them." Evelyn's voice broke as she explained her downward spiral. After Daniel left her for Jessica, she lost everything: her marriage, her stability, her sense of identity. Watching the woman she despised step into her old life, raising her children, living in the house she once called home, it had eaten away at her, day by day. "I didn't want to kill her," she said softly. "I just wanted her to suffer. Just one dose to make her sick, to ruin her perfect day. I thought maybe Daniel would see her weakness and regret choosing her over me." Mark remained silent, letting her continue. "I had the poison for months. I researched it, studied the dose carefully. It's tasteless, odorless. I thought it would just make her ill for a few days. Nausea, dizziness. Nothing fatal." Evelyn paused, staring at her hands. "But I didn't know the kids would get to it first." Her breath hitched, and for the first time Mark saw something real in her eyes. Regret. "They were always asking for ice cream," she whispered. "They must have taken the bowls before Jessica could. I should have checked. I should have known." Mark's jaw tightened. "So you're saying you would have been fine with Jessica dying?" Evelyn flinched at his sharp tone. I didn't mean—" She shook her head. "I don't know anymore." Mark closed the file and sat back. "Evelyn, your children are still in critical condition. Your youngest, Lily, is in a coma. There's no guarantee they'll make it. And if they don't—" He let the sentence hang. Tears streamed down Evelyn's face. "I didn't want this," she choked out. Mark sighed, rubbing his temple. "Intentions don't change consequences." While Evelyn wept, Mark pushed forward. "Evelyn, did anyone else know what you were planning?" She shook her head. I didn't tell anyone." Mark nodded. "Then why were your fingerprints only on some of the bowls but not the one Jessica actually took?" Evelyn looked confused. "What?" Mark tapped the table. "Jessica never got the poison bowl. Someone switched it before she had a chance to eat it." Evelyn blinked rapidly, trying to process his words. "You mean someone knew?" Mark stood up. "I don't think you acted alone, Evelyn. Whether you realize it or not, someone might have been watching. And if they were, that means this story isn't over yet." Evelyn stared at him, her face drained of color. Because suddenly she wasn't just a criminal. She might also be a pawn in someone else's game. Detective Mark Reynolds left the interrogation room with a knot in his stomach. Evelyn Carter was guilty. There was no doubt about that. But something wasn't adding up. If Jessica never ate the poison ice cream, then who switched the bowls? Back in his office, Mark spread out the forensic report and wedding footage snapshots on his desk. He had already rewatched the video a dozen times, focusing on Evelyn near the dessert table. But now, with this new theory in mind, he played the footage again, looking beyond Evelyn's actions. And then he saw it. A figure, a small, seemingly insignificant moment. Daniel Carter, Jessica's new husband. At one point, just before the kids grabbed their bowls, Daniel reached for one and hesitated, as if considering something. Then, almost too quickly to notice, he put it back and grabbed another. Mark's pulse quickened. Had Daniel known? Had he deliberately let his children take the poison bowl instead of Jessica? Mark wasted no time. Within the hour, he was sitting across from Daniel Carter in another interrogation room. Unlike Evelyn, Daniel looked calm. Too calm. "Detective, I've already given my statement," he said, leaning back in his chair. "My kids are fighting for their lives, and I need to be with them. So unless you have something new—" Mark slid a screenshot from the wedding footage across the table. "Tell me why you put that bowl back." Daniel's expression didn't change. "I don't remember. Maybe I saw a different flavor I wanted." Mark's gaze hardened. "Or maybe you recognized something was wrong." Daniel scoffed. Are you implying I knew my kids were going to be poisoned? That's ridiculous. Mark leaned forward. Is it? You had full custody of them after divorcing Evelyn, right? Daniel tensed slightly. You remarried quickly, Mark continued. Jessica and Evelyn despised each other, and Evelyn wanted Jessica to suffer, not your kids. But what if you saw an opportunity? Daniel's jaw clenched. Mark pressed on. You're a banker, Daniel. You know numbers. You know planning. Maybe you saw Evelyn messing with the ice cream. Maybe you realized what she was doing. And instead of stopping it, you let it happen. Daniel's face was blank, but his hands were clenched into fists under the table. You let your own children eat it, Mark said, his voice cold. Because if Evelyn went down for poisoning them, she'd be out of the picture. No more shared custody, no more child support, just you and your new wife, free from any connection to your past. Daniel's nostrils flared. That's insane. Mark leaned back. Is it? The only bowl with no fingerprints was Jessica's. You knew, and you let it happen. Daniel shot up from his chair. I want my lawyer. Mark smirked. He had him. Later that night, Mark received a call from the hospital. The kids had regained consciousness. Lily, the youngest, was still weak, but managed to whisper something to the doctors. My daddy, he said. Don't eat that one. Mark exhaled. It was all he needed. Evelyn Carter had planned a crime, but Daniel Carter had turned it into something far worse. Now they were both going to pay. Detective Mark Reynolds arrived at the Cook County Courthouse early that morning. The case had escalated faster than expected. With Daniel Carter now under arrest alongside his ex-wife, Evelyn, the trial promised to be a high-profile one. A mother's revenge, a father's betrayal, 3 innocent children caught in between. The media had already labeled it the Wedding Day Massacre. As Mark walked through the courthouse halls, he reflected on the twisted nature of the case. Evelyn had set the wheels in motion, but Daniel had ensured the worst possible outcome. 2 parents, both guilty, one out of bitterness, the other out of cold-hearted selfishness. Evelyn Carter sat at the defendant's table, looking hollow. She had pleaded guilty to attempted murder and reckless endangerment. Her lawyer had pushed for a reduced sentence, arguing that she never intended to harm her children. But the prosecution had made one thing clear. Intentions didn't change reality. Daniel Carter, on the other hand, had pleaded not guilty. His legal team insisted that Mark's theory was based on circumstantial evidence. But the hospital statement from Lily had sealed his fate. My daddy said, don't eat that one. It was enough to prove knowledge and premeditation. The courtroom was tense as the prosecution presented the case. Evelyn had poisoned the ice cream, believing only Jessica would consume it. Daniel had noticed the tampered bowl and deliberately swapped it, letting his own children suffer to frame Evelyn. Lily's testimony confirmed that he knew. The jury listened carefully. The wedding footage, the forensic evidence, and Lily's heartbreaking statement painted a damning picture. 2 parents, each guilty in their own way. After 3 days of deliberation, the jury returned with their decision. Evelyn Carter, guilty of attempted murder and child endangerment, sentenced to 25 years in prison. Daniel Carter, guilty of first-degree attempted murder and conspiracy, sentenced to life without parole. Jessica, the woman who was meant to be the victim, sat in the back of the courtroom, tears streaming down her face. She had barely spoken since the arrest, too shaken by the reality of what had happened. The children, still recovering in the hospital, were placed under the custody of Jessica's sister. As Daniel was led away in handcuffs, he turned to Mark and muttered, "You ruined my life." Mark didn't flinch. "No, Daniel, you did that yourself." Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed around Mark, asking for a statement. He simply said, "Justice was served today, but there's no victory when children suffer." Walking away, he thought about those kids, the ones who had lost both their parents in one day. There was no happy ending, just truth and consequences.